My sister blocked me from the will, so I organized a family intervention. It was the kind of betrayal that doesn't scream, it stings. Quietly, deeply, and without warning. One moment, I was grieving my grandfather. The next, I was standing in a room full of family members who were no longer family to me. My name is Amber. I'm 29 years old, and last month, my grandfather left me his entire estate, over $2 million. The morning after his funeral, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a black mug of coffee cooling in my hands, staring at the paperwork I hadn't asked for. It didn't feel real. Not the money. Not the house. Not the chain of hardware stores he'd built with his bare hands. But most of all, not the silence. The silence broke 2 days later with a text from my mother, Patricia. Family meeting. Sunday. Be on time. That was all. No greeting. No explanation. Just the kind of order she'd barked my entire life, dressed now in polite punctuation. The meeting was at the house where I grew up. I drove there in silence, counting the cracks in the pavement like they might offer some kind of omen. When I stepped through the front door, I felt it immediately, the stillness that comes before a storm. They were all there. My mother, standing like a queen bee in her beige power suit, lips pinched with something between satisfaction and mourning. My stepfather Craig, perched beside her like a well-trained shadow. My older sister Rachel and younger brother Jason sat across from each other, both pretending not to smirk. And then there were the 2 men I didn't recognize, both in charcoal suits, both holding leather-bound folders. Remember, my mother said as if welcoming me into her home, meet our lawyers. I didn't sit down. My heartbeat had relocated to my throat. The older lawyer, silver-haired with a rehearsed calmness, nodded at me and opened his folder. What's this? I asked, my voice neutral but not quiet. Rachel looked up, her nails clicking against the arm of her chair. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look on her face said it all. She already knew what was coming. They were contesting the will. Not together. Not as a family. Not even pretending it was for justice or closure or sentiment. Just Rachel. Rachel and my mother, who had co-signed the legal challenge under the premise that my grandfather was mentally compromised when he signed it. They claimed undue influence. They said I manipulated a dying old man into signing his legacy away from his rightful heirs. The same man who taught me how to balance a ledger when I was 13. The same man who slipped cash into my hand at college and whispered, "Don't tell your mother." The same man who once looked at me and said, "You're the only one in this family who understands what it means to build something." I didn't say a word in that room. I just stood there, watching my mother lean back like she'd already won. The lawyers handed me a packet. My stepfather offered a fake smile. My siblings avoided eye contact. When I finally left, the sun was already setting. The sky was bleeding into the horizon, soft and low, like it wanted to weep for me. I drove home without music, the folder in the passenger seat unopened. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and called the only person I could still trust, my grandfather's old attorney. His name was Martin Green. He'd retired 2 years ago but had always told me to call him if I ever needed anything. When he picked up, his voice was slower than I remembered. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said. He already knew. "I'm being ambushed," I told him. There was a long pause on the line. "Let's talk," he said. "You need to see the rest of what Harold left behind." And just like that, I realized, this wasn't over. It hadn't even started. Grief has a strange way of sharpening your focus. It cuts through the noise, the politeness, the facade. And what remained, in the silence after my grandfather's death, was a kind of clarity I wasn't ready for. The next morning, I met Martin Green at a small cafe on the edge of town. He'd aged since I last saw him, his shoulders narrower, skin thinner, but his mind was as sharp as ever. We didn't exchange pleasantries. He slid a slim envelope across the table and waited while I opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a handwritten letter from my grandfather, dated 8 months before his death. The second was a revised copy of his will, notarized and witnessed, appointing me not only as the sole heir, but also the executor of his estate, with full discretionary power over all business assets, real estate, and trust distributions. The letter was brief. Just a few lines, written in his deliberate, looping script. Amber. They will test you. Let them. You are the only one I trust to protect what matters. Love, Grandpa. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just stared at the paper, the words sinking into me like stones into deep water. Martin finally broke the silence. He said, "This letter wasn't meant for legal defense. He wrote it for you. But the revised will is airtight." I nodded slowly, folding the letter and sliding it back into the envelope. I didn't need to ask why he hadn't mentioned it sooner. He was giving me time to grieve. And, perhaps, to decide whether I would honor the man who believed in me, or run from the storm. I didn't run. Instead, I went home and opened the old safe in the back of my grandfather's office, the one hidden behind the false wall panel. I knew the code by heart, his birthday, followed by the year he opened his first store. Inside were ledgers, personal letters, stock certificates, and a worn leather notebook. That notebook held everything. Details of every major business decision he'd made over the last 10 years. Notes on each family member. Warnings about Patricia's patterns, concerns about Rachel's entitlement, even quiet hopes for Jason, my younger brother, whose learning disability had often made him the scapegoat for family dysfunction. But what struck me most were the pages about me. They weren't praise. My grandfather wasn't sentimental that way. They were observations, small, specific, clear. Amber understands the long game. Amber doesn't ask for credit. Amber listens. He'd written that last one twice. I spent the rest of that day sitting in his office, the curtains drawn, the scent of his cologne still faint on the upholstery. I didn't move until the sun dipped below the horizon and the room turned cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house in silence, my footsteps barely making a sound on the hardwood floors. Every corner held a memory, holiday dinners, late-night studying, whispered conversations. It was the only place that had ever felt like mine. I thought about Rachel's expression in that meeting. Not desperation. Not grief. Satisfaction. She'd known I was excluded from the family narrative long before the will made it official. This was just the moment she'd been waiting for. And still, part of me wanted to believe there was something salvageable in all of this. That beneath the greed and anger, there might still be a trace of family. That illusion shattered the next morning. I received an email from a law firm, different from the ones my mother had introduced at the meeting. They represented a buyer, an anonymous investor, offering to purchase my grandfather's company outright for an amount well below its appraised value. I knew immediately what it meant. Someone was trying to strip the company out from under me. And they were hoping I didn't know what it was worth. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. My grandfather had prepared me for this. I pulled out the last quarterly financials and reviewed them line by line, just as he'd taught me. The numbers were clean, the margins healthy. There was no reason to sell. None, unless someone stood to benefit from my collapse. I went to the flagship store that afternoon, the original one my grandfather built. The employees greeted me quietly. They knew who I was. More importantly, they knew who he was to me. In the back office, I met with Miguel, the store manager. He was in his 50s, kind eyes, and had worked for my grandfather since he was a teenager. He said, "Harold always said you'd be the one." I asked him if anyone else had been by to ask questions. He nodded. He said, "Rachel and your mom came last week. Asking about finances. Trying to get access to vendor contracts." I didn't give them anything. I thanked him and left the store feeling heavier than I had in weeks. They weren't just grieving differently. They were planning. Quietly. Systematically. And they had underestimated me. That realization didn't fill me with pride. It filled me with sadness. I remembered being 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, watching my mother cry over a bounced check while Rachel rolled her eyes and complained that her friends all had better phones. I remembered stepping in, helping where I could, taking on responsibilities nobody asked me to, but nobody else would. And now they saw me as the threat. At home, I found myself staring at the family photo we'd taken years ago, the one where we all wore red sweaters and pretended to care. I hadn't looked at it in years, but now it felt like a relic from a time I had finally outgrown. The phone rang that evening. It was Jason. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about the will. He just said he missed Grandpa. He said, "I don't get why everything's so messed up now." I listened to his voice, low and uncertain, and I felt a shift inside me, small, but steady. Jason had never had the tools to manipulate anyone. He didn't understand power plays or legal language. He just wanted peace. I replied, "It's going to be okay, Jace. I promise." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet and let the silence settle around me. There was nothing left to do but move forward. I opened my laptop and began drafting a letter. Not to the lawyers. Not to the press. To my family. A single invitation. One Sunday. One house. One conversation. No lawyers. No negotiations. Just us. I sent it before I could second guess it. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the funeral. Control. What I didn't know yet was how deep the rot had grown, and how far they'd go to keep their version of the truth intact. They didn't respond to the invitation. Not for days. Just silence. The kind that tells you more than words ever could. By the fourth day, I assumed that silence was the answer. And then, late Friday night, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line was one word, Sunday. Inside, it was colder than I expected. Rachel wrote it. I could tell by the clipped tone, the way everything sounded rehearsed. She confirmed they'd be there, her, Patricia, Craig, and Jason. No apologies. No explanation. Just a single line at the end that caught me off guard. "We hope you're ready to act like family again." I stared at that line for a long time. There was a time I would have tried to decode it, wondered what she meant, looked for the olive branch hidden in the thorns. But not anymore. Not after the legal ambush. Not after the offer to sell my inheritance out from under me. The only thing I hoped for now was clarity. Sunday came with low clouds and the kind of wind that stripped leaves from trees like it was tired of waiting for them to fall. I set the table. Not with anything fancy, just coffee, tea, and a plate of lemon shortbread I'd baked the night before. A quiet reminder that this was still a home, not a battlefield. They arrived together, a parade of practiced expressions and careful coats. Rachel wore heels that clicked too loudly on the hardwood. Patricia was in pearls, her perfume lingering in the air before she even crossed the threshold. Jason looked tired. And smaller somehow. They sat without being asked, like this was their house, their table, their moment to reclaim. I sat across from them, folded my hands, and waited. Rachel started. "Of course she did." She said, "We appreciate the invitation. It's time to put all this ugliness behind us." Patricia nodded, her mouth pressed into that half-smile she used when she wanted to seem reasonable. Craig didn't speak. He never did unless it was absolutely necessary. I replied, "I'm not interested in reconciliation. I'm interested in understanding how we got here." That stopped them. For a moment, no one moved. Then Patricia leaned forward, her voice low and almost gentle. She said, "You don't understand what pressure Harold put on this family. He created tension. Division. He turned you against us." The words landed like cold water. I wanted to laugh. Or scream. Instead, I stared at her until she looked away. Rachel picked up where she left off. She said, "We're willing to drop the contest if you agree to a fair distribution. 1/3 each." She said it like it was generous. Like they were offering me something instead of clawing back what they'd never earned. I replied, "You're asking me to erase Grandpa's final wishes. To pretend he didn't spend years preparing me for this." Craig finally spoke. He said, "Sometimes what's fair isn't what's legal. Families compromise." The irony nearly made me dizzy. They were asking for compromise after trying to take everything without asking. Jason shifted in his seat, fidgeting with the zipper on his jacket. He said quietly, "I don't want anything. I just want things to go back to how they were." For the first time, my voice softened. I replied, "I do too. But that world doesn't exist anymore." They didn't like that answer. Patricia's smile vanished. Rachel leaned back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Craig muttered something under his breath. I stood, slowly, and walked to the sideboard. When I returned, I placed a folder in the center of the table. Inside were copies of the will, financial statements, and a timeline of events leading up to my grandfather's death. Every detail documented. Every asset accounted for. I'd spent the past week compiling it. I said, "This is the truth. Whether you accept it or not is up to you." Patricia didn't open it. Rachel did, skimming it with the impatience of someone looking for an angle rather than an answer. She closed the folder slowly, then looked up at me with something almost resembling admiration. She said, "You were always the quiet one. The helper. Funny how people change when they get power." I replied, "I haven't changed. You just didn't see me clearly." They left without another word. No goodbyes. No hugs. Just the sound of the front door closing too hard behind them. I stood at the window, watching them walk to the car. Rachel spoke first, gesturing sharply. Patricia rubbed her temples. Craig lit a cigarette. Jason hung back, looking at the house one last time. The room felt heavier after they left, like it was holding its breath. I didn't exhale until the headlights disappeared. Later that evening, I called Martin again. He picked up on the second ring. He said, "You all right?" I replied, "They're not going to let this go." He didn't argue. He didn't reassure me. He said, "Then we prepare." And that was that. I ended the call and sat alone at the kitchen table, the scent of lemon and scorched pride hanging in the air. I stared at the family photo again. This time, I pulled it from the frame. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. This wasn't about grief anymore. It was about legacy. I knew now they weren't just trying to take money. They were trying to rewrite history. To erase the years my grandfather and I spent building something real. And I wouldn't let them. But I also knew the price of holding the line. The next morning, I woke to find my car windshield smashed and a note under the wiper blade. One word, scrawled in sharp black ink, "Thief." I didn't flinch when I saw the note. I didn't curse or cry or yell. I just stood there, staring at the shattered windshield, thinking, so this is how they want to play it. The word thief sat jagged and dark beneath the wiper blade, ink bleeding slightly from morning dew. A single word, but it said everything. I reached for it without gloves, fingerprints be damned, and folded it once before slipping it into my coat pocket. Not for evidence, just for memory. The damage to the windshield was surgical. Not a rageful smash with a bat. No wild spiderweb cracks. Just a clean impact at the base of the glass, deliberate and practiced. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. It wasn't vandalism. It was a message. I didn't bother calling the police. I knew how that would go. The officer would nod politely, ask about enemies, and jot something down without looking at me. I'd fill out a report. Nothing would come of it. There were no cameras on this side of the street. That had been intentional, too. Instead, I called Martin and told him everything, down to the folded note in my pocket. He said, "They're escalating. That's all this is. Fear dressed as bravado. I didn't respond right away. I watched a maple leaf drift across the hood of my car, trembling in the breeze, and thought about how grief has a half-life. It doesn't vanish. It just changes form. My family's grief had curdled into entitlement. Mine had solidified into resolve. After replacing the windshield, I spent the next few days quietly preparing. There was no grand plan, no dramatic revenge. Just small, deliberate acts of reinforcement. I changed every password: banking, legal, estate. I checked the locks on every door and had 2 more installed. I placed calls to the managers of each hardware store in the chain. I asked them to report any unfamiliar inquiries, especially anyone claiming to be family. Most of them already had. Rachel had visited 2 locations pretending to be conducting a family audit. Craig had emailed one of the suppliers from an account that mimicked my grandfather's, requesting financial statements. Patricia had spoken to a former employee, offering vague promises of bringing the business back into the right hands. They weren't subtle. They were confident. That confidence told me one thing: they still thought I was temporary. That I would eventually fold, cave under the pressure, hand back the keys and the titles and the accounts like a frightened girl playing dress-up in a dead man's suit. So I made sure I wouldn't. In the evenings, I pulled out the leather-bound notebook my grandfather had left in the safe. The one filled with margins, handwritten insights, exit strategies, and long-forgotten details of conversations. I cross-referenced dates, names, vendors. I made digital copies of every page, then stored the originals in a safety deposit box at a bank under my own name. I wasn't just guarding money. I was guarding memory. One night, I drove out to the cemetery. The sky was low and colorless, the air sharp with early frost. I parked and walked slowly to his grave, wrapped in a wool coat, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp ground. The stone was simple. His name. The years. And a line he'd written himself years ago, when the topic had come up over coffee and a rare bout of sentimentality. Build something worth keeping. I knelt beside the grave and ran my fingers over the words. I said quietly, "They want to tear it down." There was no answer, of course. Just the quiet rustle of trees and the scent of wet earth. I added, "I'm not going to let them." I stayed there until my knees ached and my breath grew visible. Then I stood, brushing off the dirt, and drove home in silence. The next morning, I met with Miguel at the flagship store. We locked the door after hours and sat in the back office, surrounded by aging filing cabinets and boxes of promotional materials from another era. I showed him the digital archive I'd compiled, the will, the letters, the financials. He took his time, scrolling through each page on the screen, nodding slowly. He said, "You're doing right by him. I just hope they don't push too far." I replied, "They already have." He hesitated. He said, "You might want to talk to Marco. He used to handle logistics for the southern stores before your grandfather sold them off." There was something about that deal that never sat right. I made a note. I spent the next week tracking down Marco. He lived in a small town 2 hours south, retired early after a heart attack, now working part-time at a local shipping yard. We met at a diner off the interstate, over greasy eggs and weak coffee. He was older than I remembered, but his mind was sharp. He said, "Your grandfather got out just in time. The buyer that took over those stores ran them into the ground." But it wasn't just bad management. It was deliberate. I leaned in. I replied, "What do you mean?" He said, "He sold them to a shell company. Front for a larger chain. They wanted to eliminate competition, not improve it." Harold knew. That's why he pulled out everything else. You think this fight's about inheritance, but it might be about what's left of the business too. That night, I barely slept. I went back over every document, every line of the sale agreement. There it was, language buried deep in the contract that tied a portion of remaining assets to a quiet non-compete clause. If I sold the chain within 5 years of his death, those clauses would reactivate, triggering automatic rights for the shell company to acquire key locations. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding. That's what they were after. Not the money. Not just the legacy. They were trying to push me into selling, knowing it would trigger a chain reaction that would dismantle the empire he built, store by store, deal by deal. And the only way that could happen was if I broke. I shut my laptop and stared into the dark. They weren't just coming for what was his. They were coming for what was mine now. And I had no intention of letting them take it. But as I reached for my phone to call Martin, the screen lit up with a new message. Unknown number. One sentence. Better think twice before Sunday. Threats only carry weight when they catch you off guard. But by the time that message appeared on my screen, the only thing I felt was confirmation. They were running out of patience. I didn't reply. I didn't even flinch. I let the words sit there in that backlit rectangle, then quietly powered off my phone and set it face down on the kitchen counter. Better think twice before Sunday. The irony made my throat tighten. I had been thinking, every night, every hour, every minute. But what they didn't understand, what they never understood, was that I didn't make decisions out of fear. Not anymore. I made them out of memory. That Sunday, the meeting wasn't at my grandfather's house. It was at the original store. The one with the green awning, the creaky floors, and the corner office with windows that overlooked the parking lot like a quiet watchman. I sent the invitation 2 days prior. Same format. One time. One place. No lawyers. No negotiation. Just a conversation. This time I didn't serve cookies. I stood behind the counter, arms folded, as they walked in, Rachel first, always the advance scout. Her heels struck the linoleum like they were meant to announce her. Craig followed, expression unreadable. Patricia last, in dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Jason didn't come. That alone told me something had shifted. They didn't ask why we were meeting here. They didn't look around at the shelves stocked with the same tools and hardware my grandfather once arranged himself. They walked straight to the office and sat down like it was a courtroom. I stayed standing. The folder I brought was slim. One sheet inside. A copy of the original sale clause from the Southern stores, highlighted and annotated. I laid it on the table without a word. Rachel picked it up and skimmed it. Her eyes moved quickly, but her mouth stayed still. Patricia didn't look at it. She said, "We're done with games, Amber." I didn't respond. Not yet. Craig leaned forward. He said, "This all ends with one of two outcomes. You give us a seat at the table. Or we take it." I finally spoke. I replied, "You think you're playing chess. But you don't know the board." I turned to the whiteboard mounted on the wall, the one that used to track inventory and promotions. Now it held a simple chart. 5 vertical columns, each representing one division of the company. Beneath each, a name. Not theirs. I said, "I've appointed independent trustees to oversee each regional store group. Their names are on file. Their roles are active. Effective immediately, I no longer hold day-to-day authority. The structure is legally binding and protected by a cascade trust." Silence. Rachel's hand tightened around the folder. Patricia's mouth opened, then closed. Craig blinked. I added, "You can't force a sale. You can't challenge the will. And you can't dissolve what you don't control." The air shifted. Not a gasp. Not a scream. Just a subtle, perceptible pull, the gravity of power changing direction. Patricia stood suddenly, her chair scraping loudly. She said, "You've always been ungrateful. He turned you into this. Cold. Paranoid." I replied, "No. You turned me into this. He gave me the tools. You gave me the reason." Rachel's voice was quieter when it came. She said, "So what now? You hide behind paperwork for the rest of your life? I looked at her and felt nothing. I said, no. I move on. You're the one stuck. She stood, slowly, leaving the folder behind. Her eyes found mine, but they were no longer triumphant. Just tired. She said, you think this ends it. But people don't forget humiliation. I replied, neither do I. They left as they had entered, together, but fractured. No raised voices. No final threats. Just the subtle unraveling of their certainty. I didn't follow them out. I walked to the back of the store instead, through the narrow hallway lined with framed newspaper clippings of grand openings and community donations. My grandfather's legacy in sepia tones. I stood in front of the largest frame, the photo of him in front of the first store, arms crossed, that proud smile stretched across his weathered face. I traced the edge of the frame with one finger. I whispered, it's done. But it wasn't. When I returned to the office, the folder was still on the table. But something had changed. A new paper had been slipped inside. A copy of a legal motion, and signed. A draft. They were planning one last play. Something formal. Something public. And it was going to get ugly. Some endings don't come with closure, they come with consequence. And in the days that followed that final meeting, the consequences began to unfold like slow-burning fuses. The unsigned legal draft left in the folder was no bluff. By Thursday morning, a formal complaint had been filed with the county probate court, motion to investigate executor conduct. It alleged impropriety, coercion, and mismanagement. It was dressed in legalese, but its intentions were naked. It wasn't about truth. It was about spectacle. They didn't want the estate, they wanted my character on trial. I read the motion twice, quietly, in the half-dark of my grandfather's study. Each accusation was a variation of the same implication, that I had manipulated him, isolated him, and restructured the estate to benefit myself at the family's expense. But what they hadn't counted on was documentation. My grandfather's notebook. The notarized recordings. His handwritten letters, including one he'd dictated from the hospital that winter, witnessed by his nurse and filed with Martin. I had evidence of every conversation, every transaction, every cautious decision made over the last 2 years of his life. Still, none of it stopped the machine once it began. The story leaked by the weekend. A local paper ran a headline that sounded harmless enough, "Family Rift Follows Businessman's Passing." But the subtext twisted the knife, phrases like controversial inheritance, disinherited heirs, and legal battle over beloved local chain. They weren't quoting facts. They were quoting Patricia. She had gone to the press. Rachel followed a day later with a carefully curated post on social media, a black and white photo of her as a toddler sitting on Grandpa's lap, captioned, "Wishing the man who raised me could see what's being done in his name." The comments were filled with sympathy. Strangers called me cold. Opportunistic. Unloving. I didn't respond. I didn't explain. But I kept receipts. Martin handled the legal response. With the precision of a scalpel, he dismantled their motion piece by piece, attaching documentation that exposed each claim as either inflated or outright false. He moved to dismiss. The court date was set anyway. The day before the hearing, I received a voicemail from Jason. His voice was quiet, uncertain. He said, "I don't know what to do. They said I have to testify. But I don't want to lie." I didn't call back. Not because I didn't care, but because I wouldn't ask him to choose. He already had enough weight on his shoulders. The morning of the hearing, I wore black. Not to mourn. To remember. I arrived alone. No one sat in my row. Across the aisle, Patricia, Rachel, and Craig arrived flanked by their attorney, a man in a navy suit with 2 white teeth and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't look at me once. The hearing itself was short. Clinical. The judge was calm, inquisitive, neither warm nor cold. She asked questions. listened closely. Read each document handed to her without interruption. When it was my turn to speak, I stood with both feet grounded and my hands clasped in front of me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't falter. I told the truth, clearly and without apology. I said, my grandfather spent years preparing me to run the estate. His decisions weren't rash. They were deliberate. And documented. The judge nodded once, asked a few more questions, then took the matter under review. We were dismissed by noon. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered. I kept my head down and walked past them. I wasn't going to feed the story. Let them write what they wanted. I had other work to do. That evening, I met with the trustees. We held our first formal review of quarterly performance, going through each division's numbers, staffing updates, and operational goals. There were no speeches. No drama. Just quiet, focused stewardship, the kind of leadership my grandfather valued. At the end of the meeting, Miguel handed me a sealed envelope. He said, "Harold gave this to me. Told me to deliver it after your first board meeting." I waited until I got home to open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. My grandfather's handwriting. Sharp. Measured. Amber. If they fight you, it means you're holding the right ground. Keep your eyes forward. Your job is to build. Let them destroy themselves if they must. H. I didn't cry. I folded the letter, placed it in the same envelope as the one he left me in the cafe, and tucked them both into the drawer by my bed. The next morning, I got the news. The judge had ruled in my favor. The motion was dismissed. Her ruling stated that the estate had been managed with transparency, professionalism, and fidelity to the deceased's intentions. But the damage was done. My name had been dragged through the mud. My face had been posted online, my character dissected by strangers. There would be no family Christmas that year. No Sunday dinners. No neutral ground. They didn't lose quietly, either. Rachel posted another photo, this one of Grandpa's old store, captioned, "Some things are lost forever." Jason stopped returning my messages. Craig's name disappeared from the store's vendor emails, though I later learned he'd been reaching out to competitors with information about our supply chain. Patricia sent me a final text, "You were never one of us." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I deleted it. What none of them realized, what they never understood, was that I never wanted the money. I wanted the work. The legacy. The continuity of something built with calloused hands and quiet integrity. They thought they could shame me into surrender. But all they did was prove that I was the right one to carry it forward. Still, when the first anonymous package arrived, no return address, just a small box wrapped in brown paper, I paused. Inside was a rusted key. And a note. Typed. "You missed something." Sometimes the past doesn't haunt you with memories, it taps you on the shoulder and hands you a key. I turned the rusted metal over in my hand, studying the notches, the worn edges. It wasn't familiar at first glance, but something about it made my pulse slow. There was weight in it, not just physically, but in what it might unlock. A question I hadn't asked. A door I hadn't opened. The note had no handwriting. Just those 3 typed words, "You missed something." I didn't tell Martin. I didn't tell anyone. Instead, I traced every possibility. The house. The office. The flagship store. The old boat we used to visit on Sundays before the lake got too busy. Each had its own locks. All accounted for. Until I remembered the shed. Not the garden one behind the house. The other. 12 years ago, my grandfather bought a storage unit downtown, one of those nondescript places tucked between warehouses and train tracks. I only saw it once, on a Saturday when we took an unexpected detour after lunch. He never explained why he rented it. Just said some things were easier to keep off-site. I drove there the next morning. The receptionist at the desk was new, probably half my age, scrolling on her phone until I asked for access. She raised an eyebrow at the key. She said, "We upgraded to card codes years ago." I replied, "He never liked upgrades." She checked the system. Unit 14B was still active. Paid in full for the next decade. And, somehow, still on mechanical access. One of 3 in the entire facility. She handed me a clipboard. I signed. The hall was cold. Not with temperature, but with memory. I found the unit and slid the key into the lock. It resisted for a second, then clicked. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cedar. And something else, old paper, I think. Or maybe time. There wasn't much. A small desk. 3 file boxes. A banker's lamp. A chair. I sat. Turned on the lamp. Waited until the light steadied. The files weren't business-related. Not directly. They were personal. Letters. Journals. Photos. But not of me. Of her. My grandmother. She died before I was born. I'd only seen one photo of her, the one in his office, beside the clock. A woman with clear eyes and a quiet mouth. I'd asked once, and he told me she was the strongest person he'd ever met. Then he changed the subject. Now I understood why. The letters were from her. To him. Dozens of them, handwritten on thick cream paper, dated before I was born. Some from their early marriage. Others from hospital stays. One marked simply, "For the day after." She wrote of hope. Of exhaustion. Of raising a daughter, Patricia, with love and fear. Of watching that daughter grow cold and sharp. She wrote of regret. Of things she wished she'd said aloud. There was one envelope sealed separately, marked with my name. I opened it with care. Amber. If you're reading this, it means Harold kept his promise. He always said you were different. That you didn't want the house or the stores or the money, you wanted to understand. So here's what I can give you. Your mother was loved. Deeply. But she was also damaged. I don't know where it began. Maybe with my own silences. Maybe with Harold's distance. But you are not her. You have something she never had. Stillness. Not passivity. Stillness. That rare ability to wait, to see, to endure. Use it. And forgive her if you can. Not for her sake. For yours. This world is loud. Let your quiet be your strength. Love. Eleanor. I didn't cry. Not then. I closed the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and sat there for a long time, surrounded by the quiet echo of people I'd never known, shaping the life I'd been trying to protect. By the time I locked the unit and stepped back into the sunlight, something inside me had shifted. Not healed. Just realigned. In the weeks that followed, the noise from the family began to fade. The court ruling settled more than just the will. Patricia stopped calling. Rachel's online posts became less frequent, then disappeared altogether. Craig went back to whatever part-time consulting gig kept him busy enough to avoid reflection. Jason sent a single email. No apology. Just a line of text. I miss him too. I didn't reply. But I kept it. The trustees met again that quarter. Performance was strong. 2 stores had expanded their outreach programs. One launched a local scholarship in Harold's name. I didn't attend the meetings anymore. I watched the recordings from home, in silence, letting their voices carry the work forward. And I kept building. Not stores. Systems. Infrastructure. Quiet changes that no one would notice until they needed them. Emergency funds for employees. Maintenance rotations. A legacy that didn't show up in headlines, but in stability. The house felt different now. Not haunted. Just quieter. Like it had finally stopped waiting for something. Sometimes I sat in the old chair by the window and reread Eleanor's letter. Not because I needed her permission, but because it reminded me that silence, too, is a kind of inheritance. The last thing I did was simple. I took the family photo from its frame, the one with all of us in red sweaters, smiling at a camera none of us looked at directly, and I replaced it. In its place, I hung a photograph I found in the storage unit. A black and white image of my grandfather and grandmother standing outside the first store. She's holding a paper bag. He's adjusting the sign. They're not smiling. But they look whole. This is the story they never told. And now, it's the one I carry. Because in the end, it wasn't revenge I wanted. It was restoration. And maybe, just maybe, that's what I found. The wind has started to shift outside. I can hear it brushing against the windows, steady and constant. It sounds like a beginning.